They called him the Elephant Man.
Why's your engine, Vic?
He was deformed beyond reason, grotesque beyond understanding, ridiculed beyond endurance, and courageous beyond measure. The Elephant Man, the film, rated PG.
Welcome again to another Adam's Corner. My recurring guest, Ray Morton, is returning yet again because the public demands it.
You can't get rid of me.
No, we love having you on, and we do these podcasts every couple of months. We do one where we go back, and it's kind of become a tradition here, or a regular thing, and people do look forward to these. And we take a look at a movie that's celebrating some sort of an anniversary. Sometimes we're a little bit late, as we were with More American Graffiti. But I think we're right on the money with the subject of this episode, and that is The Elephant Man, which is turning 45, which is really just mind-blowing to imagine that it is. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the behind-the-scenes story of the creation of David Lynch's The Elephant Man. Now, for those of you listening who don't know, Ray is the author of many great books about the behind-the-scenes goings-on some of our favorite films, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, A Hard Day's Night, and there's a whole history of King Kong that he did that is terrific, and he's giving us an update on that pretty soon. It should be coming into bookstores and places where you purchase your books here, probably.
Rumor has it February of next year, but we will see. But that is, right now, that is the date I have been told. So if you're a Kong fan, please look out for it.
Oh, well, we are looking forward to it. I know I am. I can't wait. I can't get here soon enough. So, so psyched about that. So without further ado, we're going to talk about David Lynch's The Elephant Man. This is kind of a bittersweet, too, because we lost Mr. Lynch in January of this year. And so this is one of his greatest films, one of the best films in his catalog, in my estimation. It's the perfect blending of his more art house sensibilities with a more cohesive narrative, I guess you would say.
Yes, it tells a story.
It tells a story, and that's kind of my sweet spot. I don't mind the art house shenanigans that he was known for in small doses, but in some of his other films that he became known for, it's a little bit overkill for me personally, and I know that's probably heresy for me to say, but I'll just go ahead and get that out there and just just go ahead and say what I have to say about that. I do admire Mr. Lynch's talents. I realize what a true visionary he was. And we'll talk about his path getting to direct The Elephant Man. I guess we can start with that briefly if you want to, or we can just go ahead and start about how the project got developed. Either or.
Sure. Well, he came into it a little after it got rolling, so maybe we'll start with how it got rolling, and then we can talk about him coming into it. But it's funny. I have many personal associations with Altadena, California, which has recently suffered from the terrible fires that we had out here in January. And I was interested to find out, when I was doing a little background research for this, that The Elephant Man began in Altadena, California as well, the movie. It began because there was a screenwriter named Christopher DeVore, and he was working at the time. This would have been in the later 70s, 77, 78. And he was working with a friend named Eric Berggren, and they were writing scripts, trying to get a career going. And Christopher DeVore lived in Altadena, California. And apparently one day his landlady gave him a book that I guess she got from the Book of the Month Club or something that she wasn't interested in, but she thought he might like it. And it was a book, I don't recall the title, but something like Very Unusual People or something like that. And there was a chapter in there on the Elephant Man. And that intrigued Christopher DeVore. So then he searched out. There are two pretty famous works about the Elephant Man. The first, the doctor who became involved with Joseph Merrick, which is the Elephant Man's real name, not John Merrick. Somehow, well, I'll explain that. But the doctor who helped him was a doctor named Frederick Treves, and he wrote a memoir in the early 1900s called The Elephant Man and Other Reminiscence. And he did talk about the case of, he called him John Merrick, and that's why he became known as John Merrick. Nobody quite knows why he changed his name. But anyway, the actual Elephant Man was a real person named Joseph Merrick. He was born in England. Apparently, his first couple of years, he was basically developing in a normal fashion. And then my understanding is he had three different diseases, which obviously very unusual. There was what was going on with his spine. He also had these tumorous growths all over his body, and he had pituitary issues. And all of those things combined, created his misshapen form. And he was unable to work. His mother died when he was young. His father remarried and disowned him because his new wife couldn't bear the sight of Joseph. He ended up in a workhouse, which was a place that poor people went in England. They would check themselves into these places. They weren't quite prisons, but they were like dormitories, and then they would put people to work doing manual labor, so mining and all sorts of things, as a way of earning a keep to be able to survive, people who couldn't survive otherwise. At a certain point, Joseph Merrick didn't want to continue to do that, and probably couldn't with his physical deformities. The only other avenue available to him was to put himself on display in a freak show, which was a very common thing in carnivals and circuses and traveling shows in Europe at that time. So he actually signed a contract with a handler, with an agent, a promoter, and they went around to these different locales, and he would exhibit himself as the Terrible Elephant Man. That's when he got that nickname. And they invented a story about his mother being knocked over by an elephant when he was young, when she was pregnant with him before he was born. And so they concocted this, and it was all part of this show. And then at a certain point, in England anyway, they were starting to shut down these shows. They felt they were exploitation. So unlike the fictional versions of his life, he actually got along very well with the promoter who showed him. There was no abuse. There was no difficulties, but the show got closed down, so he had to go over to Europe to continue. So he went to Europe and toured around France and Brussels with a different promoter who eventually robbed him and left him destitute. So he had to find his way back to England. That's when he came into the company of Dr. Treves. And as all of the depictions that people may know about his story, he ended up becoming a permanent resident at the London hospital and spent the last 6 years of his life in relative comfort, even though his physical deformities could never be cured. So that was the true story of Joseph Merrick. Christopher DeVore read this. He and Eric Berggren did more research. The other major book is, there was an anthropologist named Ashley Montague, and he put out a book in the early 70s that covered different cases, but one of them being the Elephant Man. And that was probably in the air quite a bit in the early 70s. The story of Joseph Merrick was becoming known mostly because of Ashley Montague's book. And that kind of explains, and we'll talk about that as we go along, how a number of different Elephant Man projects started to pop up in the mid and later 70s. And I kind of trace that to Montague's book, which was a well-reviewed and best-selling book. Anyway, DeVore and Berggren did their research and decided they were going to write a script about the Elephant Man. So they wrote a screenplay. And at the time, DeVore's girlfriend was a babysitter for an assistant director and production manager named Jonathan Sanger. And at one point she knew, and for those who don't know, assistant directors are the people who run the sets. They make sure everybody's where they got to be. They make sure the schedule's being followed. So their job is more of a practical, technical one. And a production manager is the person who does the actual day-to-day scheduling and again, making sure things are where they belong. So these are not creative positions. They are logistical and technical positions. And this is what Jonathan Sanger was. He was born in New York, but eventually worked his way out to California. Anyway, his babysitter said, "My boyfriend wrote a script. Would you read it?" And she gave it to Jonathan Sanger, who then put it on his desk, and he said he didn't get to it for almost a year. He just got busy with other things. And anyone who's ever been given a script to read knows sometimes it can take quite a while for people to get around to it. But anyway, he finally sat down and he read this script and he loved it. He did not know the story of the Elephant Man. And so he was intrigued by that. He also just thought that the script was very, very good. And he had been wanting to make the jump to be a creative producer, which is not always easy to do. People might think because you're sort of an associate producer and a production manager that it's easy to become a producer. That would be the next step. But that's not always the case because a creative producer is often a very different thing than a practical producer. Anyway, he decided to pay DeVore and Berggren some option money so that he could then take the script around and see if he could get somebody interested in financing it. And, his position allowed him to know people at different studios, but he was not the kind of guy who was going to be able to get meetings with the heads of studios and things like that. So he talked to the people that he could get access to, and there was a fair amount of interest in the story, but ultimately nobody wanted to make it because they couldn't figure out how they would sell it, and they were worried that it would be too disturbing and that audiences wouldn't come out for it. So although people admired the quality of the project, they didn't really want to make it. As it turns out, one of Jonathan Sanger's jobs that he was working on as a associate producer was a film called Fatso, which was being directed. It was the only film actually ever directed by Anne Bancroft, the actress. And it was being produced sort of off the record by her husband, Mel Brooks, who everyone knows as a legendary comic writer, director, actor. And Anne Bancroft got along well with Jonathan Sanger. Mel Brooks got along well with him. And as Jonathan Sanger tells it, one night he left the Elephant Man script in his office, which he shared with Mel Brooks at Mel Brooks's company. And I guess Mel Brooks saw the script and wanted something to read, so he took it home with him. But anyway, he ended up reading it, and he called up Sanger and he said, "Where did you get this script?" And Sanger told him the story of the babysitter and that he optioned it, and Mel Brooks was interested. He said, "So you own the rights to this script?" And he said, "Well, I own it, through an option period, but yeah, right now I own the rights to it." Well, Mel Brooks, again, known as a great comedic talent, also had a very serious side. He's a very well-read man, very interested in history and all sorts of drama, not just comedic things. And after producing Fatso for Anne Bancroft, he decided that he was going to set up a company to make films other than comedies that he would produce. And he decided that The Elephant Man would be the first production of his new company, which was called Brooks Films. His comedy films were produced through a company called Crossbow, but his new company would be called Brooks Films. And he wanted to make Elephant Man the first project. So he and Jonathan Sanger made a deal where Jonathan Sanger would become the producer of The Elephant Man. Mel Brooks would be the executive producer. So they set it up. And the other thing Mel Brooks wanted to do was he wanted to produce the film independently. He didn't want a studio to finance it because he felt that way they could keep more control over the project. And also, if it earned any money, they'd be able to keep more of the profits, which is why people want to be independent producers. So what they ended up doing was they made a distribution deal with Paramount Pictures in America for about $1.5 million. And so Paramount, when the movie was ready, would distribute it, but they weren't making it. He made another deal with a company over in Europe called EMI, and they would handle the European distribution. And he got, again, another $1.5 million or $2 million from them. And the budget for the film was going to be $6 million. So to get the other $4 million, he went to the NBC television network, and he basically said, in those days, the TV networks would pay a fair amount of money for a popular feature film to show it on the network. Sometimes they'd pay $2, $3, $4 million. Sometimes they'd pay $10 million, depending on what the movie was. So he went to Fred Silverman, the head of NBC, and he said, I'm going to make this movie, and I want you to buy the television rights for it ahead of time. And for whatever reason, Fred Silverman said he would do that. He made Mel Brooks promise to do a comedy special for the network, and then he gave them the additional $4 million. As it turns out, Mel Brooks never did the comedy special, but that's down the road. Anyway, very quickly, they had the $6 million they needed to make the movie. So the next step was they needed to get a director. And at the time, a couple of things were happening. Mel Brooks was working with a guy named Stuart Kornfeld, and Stuart Kornfeld was his sort of assistant, and he would become sort of an executive producer on different projects for Mel Brooks. And he was the guy who he was in charge of developing all the different projects. And one of the things a development person does is they see all of the new films and they check out new talent. So anyway, they weren't really sure who they were going to approach to direct this. But Stuart Kornfeld told Jonathan Sanger, hey, I saw this really interesting movie the other night called Eraserhead. So for those who are not familiar with David Lynch's background, David Lynch began his career as a fine artist. He was a painter. He went to the, I'm not going to get the name of the school right, but I think it was the Pittsburgh Institute of Fine Art. He trained as a fine art painter, and that was going to be his career. But while he was at art school, he started to make short films. He initially started by just trying to make little animations to bring his paintings to life, and then gradually started to tell little stories. He made a very well-known short film called The Grandmother, about a lonely boy who grows his own grandmother from some seeds so that he won't be lonely anymore, and a few other short films. This got him into the American Film Institute, which was just beginning in Los Angeles. David Lynch was in the first class at the American Film Institute, and that's a conservatory out here in LA that trains filmmakers. I was lucky enough to go to it many years after David Lynch. And they train writers and directors and producers. And David Lynch was accepted as a directing fellow. And normally what you did at the American Film Institute was you would make several short films. Well, he had an idea for a film that he wanted to make. Usually the films were like 10 minutes long. He wrote this 20-page script for what eventually became Eraserhead. And because in the world of movie making, 1 page of script equals 1 minute of screen time, the AFI people said, well, you're going to make this 20-minute movie. That's twice as long as we usually let you. And Lynch said, well, just let me do it. And somehow he persuaded them, and he started to make this movie. And for those who have not seen it, Eraserhead is a very surrealistic film about a man who marries a woman and they have a baby, and the baby is kind of a monster, and it takes over their lives, and the young man is kind of driven out of his mind, and in the end his head gets chopped off and stuck in a pencil factory and turned into erasers, and then he wakes up and it's all a dream. But even in the dream world, it's still a surrealistic kind of nightmare world. David Lynch had just had his first child, and most people think he was reacting badly to fatherhood, which is where the idea of the monster baby and Eraserhead came from. Anyway, the project grew and grew, and eventually took Lynch 5 years to finish. And he ended up living, at the time, the AFI was located at a place called Greystone. which was the grounds of a fancy mansion in Beverly Hills, and they had stables, and Lynch somehow got them to agree to let him use the stables as his studio. And then at some point he was broke and he moved into the stables. And he basically lived there for 5 years working on this weird movie that grew from 20 minutes to a full-length feature. And the American Film Institute ended up putting some money into it. And anyway, it came out in 1977. It was called Eraserhead. The critics didn't really know what to make of it because they didn't really know how to deal with the film's surrealism. It became one of the first midnight movies. In fact, I think it was the first midnight movie, which was a big trend in the late 70s and early 80s, where they'd get these kind of offbeat cult films and show them at midnight screenings at like art theaters around the country. The most famous one of these being the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which kind of became a different thing. But Eraserhead was the first of these midnight movies. And it got a lot of attention from sort of the alternative press and the underground press. It didn't get a lot of mainstream attention. But anyway, Stuart Kornfeld saw it and he told Jonathan Sanger, "You got to see this movie. It's really far out." Jonathan Sanger went to see the movie and he loved it. He said it was so strange. He just wanted to meet the guy who made it. He had no thought of offering Lynch a job. He just wanted to meet him. So he had met Lynch. They met for, as anyone knows, the legend of David Lynch. They met for coffee and chocolate shakes at Bob's Big Boy, and which is a fast food restaurant out here, and one of David Lynch's favorite haunts. And they were just talking. They talked about Eraserhead, and then they started talking about other projects. And at the time, David Lynch was writing a script, one of the famous unmade scripts called Ronnie Rocket. And so he told Jonathan Sanger about that. And then Jonathan Sanger told him about The Elephant Man. And when David Lynch heard that title, he didn't know what it was about. He said, "That's interesting. Could I read the script?" So Sanger gave him the script. And he said a day or two later, David Lynch called him and said, "If you don't have a director for this movie, I would love to be considered. I would love to make this movie." So he and Lynch got together again. Lynch gave him some of his ideas, which Jonathan Sanger loved, and he wanted David Lynch to make the movie. But he had to get Mel Brooks's approval, and he had no idea how Mel Brooks was going to respond to Eraserhead. So they arranged a screening. Lynch got a print, and they screened it at a screening room at 20th Century Fox. David Lynch wouldn't come in. He didn't want to be part of it. He was too anxious. And Jonathan Sanger said as the movie started to unspool, he started to realize, oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. Mel Brooks is going to hate this movie, this weird, surrealistic black and white art film. Well, apparently Mel Brooks loved the movie. And he wanted to meet David Lynch. So David Lynch came into the office, and famously Mel Brooks went up to him and hugged him and said, "You're a madman. I want you to direct this movie." And that's how David Lynch got the job.
That's a very interesting story, to say the least.
Very unusual. It's not really how things usually happen, but it's very cool.
Yeah, it's a very circuitous route, as they say. Yeah, and all these. It's funny how just everything just came together with the script and David Lynch and all this, and it's really an amazing backstory on how it actually just everything coincided.
Yeah.
So I guess we could talk about the casting. That's a very important thing. Because
Sure.
it's the casting of John Merrick was certainly pivotal to this film's success, in my opinion. So I guess we could talk about that a little bit.
What's interesting, like it's one of the, again, like you were just talking about how everything came together. The cast came together fairly easily because they basically got their first choices on almost everybody. And what happened was they were trying to think of who would play the Elephant Man. And somehow Dustin Hoffman's name got in the mix. I don't know whether it was that Hoffman's agent approached them, but there was talk very briefly of Dustin Hoffman, but Mel Brooks thought that would be a bad idea, and his reason was he said if you cast a well-known famous movie star in this part. He goes, everybody's going to know it's the movie star, and they're going to be looking at the makeup, and they're going to be looking for where the makeup is joined to the movie star's face, because they were going to keep looking for the movie star within the makeup. And he said that would mean they wouldn't accept the character as himself. So he thought what they needed to do was get a great actor, but not somebody known by the general public, well known by the general public. And they also wanted it to be an English actor because obviously the character was English. I don't think they insisted on it, but it obviously seemed like a good idea. And at that point, John Hurt was a well-known English stage actor, and he had done several films, but none where he was like a standout in them. He was in I believe The Lion in Winter and a few other films where he played parts, got good notices, but he wasn't one of those actors that jumped out at you. But he had just made a TV movie in England. There was a famous person in England, a guy named Quentin Crisp, sorry, I'm mispronouncing, who was really a gay rights pioneer in the UK, which we had fairly restrictive anti-gay laws in this country. The ones in the UK were even more restrictive. And Quentin Crisp was this very very out there gay man, very flamboyant, and he was a civil servant in England. And they kept trying to get him to tone himself down and threatened to fire him and all these things to kind of repress him. And he just was very out about that he was gay and that he was flamboyant. And he became a well-known uh, figure in England, very notorious because at those days, homosexuality was actually against the law. So this was a man flaunting the law and being himself. And they ended up making a TV movie out of it called The Naked Civil Servant. And John Hurt played Quentin Crisp. And this only people of a certain age are going to remember this. But back in the 70s, the late 70s, a bunch of TV stations around the United States showed programming from the Thames Television Network. And they called it, in New York, it was on Channel 9, so they called it Thames on 9. I don't know what they called it in other areas of the country. I don't know how that came about, but I remember they showed The Naked Civil Servant. I remember seeing that film. I was in high school at the time. I didn't really understand the issues and who Quentin Crisp was, but it was a very striking performance. Anyway, Mel Brooks had seen this performance, and he said, let's consider John Hurt. And Jonathan Sanger saw the film, David Lynch saw the film, and they agreed they wanted John Hurt, who at the time was just finishing this science fiction movie that he had to fill in for another actor, and were just wrapping it up in England, and then John Hurt had come over to the United States to do publicity for The Naked Civil Servant. The film he just finished was called Alien, and that wasn't going to be out for a little while, but so he came over, and they had him come to Mel Brooks's office at 20th Century Fox. He thought he was going for a comedy. And they put giant pictures of John Merrick all around the office. And they didn't tell him why he was there. They were just talking about his acting, and he just kept seeing these pictures. And he said it finally dawned on him that they wanted him to play this character. And the reason they had put all these giant pictures around was they wanted John Hurt to get used to what the character looked like, so it wouldn't be a shock when they said to him, basically, we want you to do a movie in which we're going to cover your entire face with makeup. And by the time they got to the end of the interview, John Hurt was like, I'm in. I want to do this. And unlike some more movie star folks, he had no problem doing a role in makeup. He thought that made sense to him, so he wasn't going to object. They felt like someone like, if you got a bigger star, they were going to have a lot of problems not wanting to be covered in all this makeup. So anyway, they got John Hurt right away. He was the first guy cast for the film. Then they needed someone to play the doctor who helps the Elephant Man, Dr. Treves. And they bandied around a few names, but they settled on Anthony Hopkins, who at that time, Hopkins had a couple of interesting career times. He made a huge debut at the National Theatre in London on stage in the early and mid 60s. And then he had transitioned into films. Also, he was in The Lion in Winter. And but his film career never quite caught fire. And he ended up coming to the United States in the mid 70s and ended up doing a lot of TV stuff here. And again, not quite making an impact. He had done the most visible thing he had done was a film called Magic, which was a thriller horror film in which he played a demented ventriloquist. He was doing a lot of roles like that, and he was kind of unhappy with how his career was going. He also had a very serious drinking problem, and he finally decided he was going to go back to England and get his drinking under control and try to restart his career. So he was an actor who was well known in the business and respected, not necessarily a star. He had just appeared in A Bridge Too Far, which was one of these all-star cast films that came out at the end of the 70s. So again, he was somebody audiences knew, but not a big star at that time. Silence of the Lambs was still 11 years away at this point. But they thought he would be a great balance because there were a number of maybe bigger, higher profile actors who didn't want to act in the movie because they would felt that John Hurt would get all the attention, the character would get all the attention. So they decided, let's go for Anthony Hopkins. And apparently Hopkins, his agent said no, he wouldn't do it. So somehow Christopher DeVore took the script, and I think Hopkins was in a play in Los Angeles. He just went to the stage door, and when Hopkins came out, handed him the script, said, "We're doing this movie and we want you to be in it." Hopkins read the script and called his agent and said, "I want to do this movie." So they got Hopkins pretty right away in one of the ways you should never ever approach an actor, by going around their agent. But that's exactly what they did, and then they got him. With that cast in mind, they began pre-production in England, and they were going to cast all of the rest of the roles out of England. And they met with a very famous British casting director named Mary Selway, who did all of the major films in the late 70s, all through the 80s. If you ever watch a film made in England in that time, you're probably going to see the name Mary Selway. She did the Indiana Jones movies and a lot of the Star Wars movies and things. Anyway, she read the script and told Jonathan Sanger. She met with David Lynch and Jonathan Sanger. She read the script and she said, "Well, I think it's lovely and it's going to be a great movie, but this movie should really be made by English filmmakers, not two very nice American boys." And Jonathan Sanger said, "Well, we're the guys making the movie." So Mary Selway refused to work on the movie. So they ended up getting another casting director, and then they got some big names. They got Sir John Gielgud to play the hospital administrator, and of course, very famous actor, so good for the cast. Wendy Hiller, another famous British actress, playing the head of the nursing staff at the hospital. And then they got Freddie Jones, who's a very famous British character actor at the time, who actually turned down the role. Everyone else accepted the part right away. He turned it down. The part they wanted him to play was the Elephant Man's promoter, keeper, owner, however you want to characterize it. And in the script, very much a departure from reality. The character was written as like a sadistic, exploitative character. And Freddie Jones didn't want to play that. He said, "I want this guy to have some kind of sympathetic relationship with the Elephant Man." And what they came up with this idea of the promoter loved the Elephant Man, but also hated him because he loved him. He actually cared about him as a person, but also saw him as a meal ticket, but also resented the fact that he had to use him as a meal ticket, that he couldn't be successful on his own. A little bit of complicated shading, but Freddie Jones insisted on it, and they wrote it into the script, and then he accepted the part. For if you really want to get into some trivia, anyone who was a fan of the Queen movie that came out a few years ago, Bohemian Rhapsody, or Rocket Man, the Elton John,
Hmm.
Biopic, sorry.
Yes.
Both of those films were directed by a guy called Dexter Fletcher. And Dexter Fletcher was a child actor in England years before. He's actually in The Elephant Man as the assistant to Bites, who is the Elephant Man's keeper. So future director Dexter Fletcher is in the film with a fairly substantial part. And the other famous Elephant Man part is Mrs. Kendall, who was a famous actress, stage actress in England at the late 1890s and turn of the century. And they ended up casting Anne Bancroft, who happened to be married to Mel Brooks. But Mel Brooks apparently actually told them, Anne read the script and wants to do the part. It's up to you guys whether you want to cast her or not. And Lynch and Sanger said, we're going to cast her. First of all, they just thought she was a great actress, but also they thought it was probably a good idea that when the boss's wife wants to play the part, you should probably let her play the part, especially when she's an Academy Award-winning actress. So Anne Bancroft joined the cast as well. And so they had all of those folks assembled. The other big aspect of the film, obviously, was they needed to create the Elephant Man makeup. And that's one of the trickier aspects of the film. David Lynch, if anyone who's seen Eraserhead knows that the monstrous baby in the movie is just this striking, odd, nobody really knows what it was. Was it a special effect? Was it some kind of animal fetus? David Lynch would never reveal how he created the baby. And to the day he died, he would not explain it. He just said, you just have to accept it for what it is. And he wanted to do the makeup on the Elephant Man himself. Mel Brooks didn't think that was a great idea. He said, you're going to have your hands full directing. You really should let someone else do it. And Jonathan Sanger felt the same way, but also felt like he wanted to be supportive of Lynch. So they agreed that he could give it a try. So they went over to England and were doing pre-production, and David Lynch spent several months creating the makeup he wanted to use for the Elephant Man. And from what I have read and what has been reported, he ended up doing a perfect sculpture of Joseph Merrick. Like they said, it looked brilliant. But David Lynch was not a makeup artist. And they said when they brought John Hurt in to have him test out the makeup, they said as soon as it went on, it just looked like a mask. It never looked like anything but a mask. And so it was a disaster, basically, because they couldn't shoot with it. And they were at that point only several weeks away from filming. And they had left David Lynch alone. They had given him the opportunity, but the makeup didn't work. And there was actually thought that they might have to cancel the movie because obviously, if you couldn't get the makeup right, you didn't have a movie. So they kind of thought about, could we go to the major makeup names of the day? And at that time, the major makeup people were Dick Smith, who did the makeup on the Godfather movies and on Little Big Man and on The Exorcist, and John Chambers, who had done the Planet of the Apes makeup, and Stuart Freeborn, who had done the creatures in the Star Wars films. All three were busy. So there was someone was recommended to them, a makeup artist named Christopher Tucker, who had actually done some work on a couple of the Star Wars movies, was mostly known for doing makeup for television productions in England. And they went to him, and he basically told them, I can do it. He asked for a huge amount of money because he kind of knew they were stuck. But he also told them, I'm going to need at least 6 weeks to create this makeup. Now, the problem is they were like 2 weeks from shooting. So what they ended up doing is reworking the entire production schedule to save all of the Elephant Man scenes where he has to appear in the makeup for the very, very end of the shooting schedule. And there were a number of other scenes in which he was supposed to appear. And it's kind of a little bit like the shark and Jaws, where when the shark and Jaws didn't work, they kind of needed to come up with other ways to represent the shark. Well, what they did in the Elephant Man was the real Elephant Man would walk around in the streets wearing a long cloak and a hood over his head because people were just too frightened of him when he didn't have the mask on. And they were going to use this in the film for a couple of early scenes. What they ended up doing was having the Elephant Man appear in many, many more scenes in this hood and in this cape. And David Lynch was disappointed. He had wanted to show the Elephant Man in full face much sooner in the movie. But as anyone who has seen the film knows, and David Lynch himself later said, it was much more effective to delay the appearance of the character and just put him in the hood and the cape. And so that was their compromise on that.
Yeah, that's I remember seeing it in a theater when it came out, and I was just quite blown away when he's finally revealed. I'll never
Yes.
forget the emotions that I had. I was in the fifth grade when that happened. So,
Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, very striking.
very striking. That's a good
It's a
way to put it.
marvelous job of makeup. And if you've ever seen any images of the Elephant Man, it's exactly what he looked like. And one of the things they did is, it's a little gruesome, but there's a museum at the London Hospital. And after Joseph Merrick died, they took a cast actually of all of him. They cast his head, they cast his torso, all in plaster, and his arm, because he had one delicate arm and one misshapen arm. And so they basically had all of these plaster casts of his entire body. They also, rather gruesomely, had his skeleton on display. So I guess they had cut away the tissue. Anyway, Christopher Tucker was allowed to borrow the bust of the elephant man, which actually had not been out of its case since it was put in, which would have been at that time almost 80 years before. And they said when they got the bus to the studio, to the artist studio, one of the remarkable things about it was when they did the casting on the plaster and pulled it off, some of Joseph Merrick's hair was stuck in there, that you could still see his hair in the casting. So kind of eerie and a little gruesome. But Christopher Tucker used the sculpture as the basis for his makeup, and it's an exact replica of what the man looked like. It was done in foam rubber. That was before they started using silicone for makeup. And it took the first day that they applied the makeup for a test, it took 12 hours to get John Hurt into the makeup. They eventually got it down to, I think they said about 6 hours. But but what happened was, because it took him so long to get into the makeup, the shooting day was almost over by the time he was able to get to the set. And the thing about, in the United States, you can work a crew as long as you want, as long as you agree to pay overtime. In the United Kingdom, the unions had much more power, so you actually had to stick to I can't remember now if it was an 8 hour or a 10 hour day, and the only way you could go over was if all of the unions agreed, and even then you could only go over by like 15 minutes or a half hour. They would not let you like shoot for long periods of time past the agreed upon day. So of course the problem is it took about 6 hours to get John Hurt into makeup, which would leave anywhere between 2 and 4 hours to film, and that wasn't going to work. The other thing was the adhesives that they had to use to put all of the different pieces of makeup on John Hurt's skin were very abrasive, and basically he couldn't wear it day after day because his skin would start to break down into sores. So what they ended up working out, and they got all the unions on board, because what Jonathan Sanger reported was the crew really was behind this movie, and therefore they were willing to make concessions that they might not have otherwise been willing to make. So what they ended up working out was, they would shoot. John Hurt would come in and get into the makeup, and then they would shoot a double day, like work after John Hurt got on set, they'd work 8 to 10 hours. So you were getting around to like an 18-hour day roughly. And they would do 2 days worth of filming in in one session, and then they would take the next day off. So the crew was willing to work basically a double shift as long as they could have the day off, and that gave John Hurt a chance to have rest his skin from the makeup, and also allowed them to work out some kind of, reasonable schedule. So they ended up shooting the Elephant Man in makeup scenes on an every other day schedule for the last like 3 weeks of the schedule, basically.
Yeah, you can only imagine how difficult that would be starting your day at so early and finishing as late as he
Yeah,
did. Even though he was getting every other day off,
right.
still that's yeah. I think the filming. I was trying to do some research here and see how long it took them to actually how long the shooting took, but it looks like they pretty well stuck to the schedule. It doesn't look like they got, from what I'm reading, that they got behind or anything like that. From what
No,
I'm,
it was I believe an 8 week schedule, and they pretty much stuck to it. I mean, they had to do a lot of rearranging because of the makeup issues, but they rearranged. There was a very famous British production guy named Terence Clegg who was in charge of the actual scheduling and production. And Jonathan Sanger has given him a lot of credit. He said he's the guy who made everything work. And they didn't go over budget. They stuck to budget. They stuck to schedule, which you almost never hear of. And
yeah,
especially it was David Lynch's first, I, I'm gonna I'm gonna say real film, and of course Eraserhead is a real film. It was his first film made in the traditional manner with a crew, actors, a cinematographer, and pretty amazing that a guy who really had made this film basically on weekends for 5 years came in, was able to take over an entire production and run it without any hitches. Normally there's a break-in time for first-time directors on a major professional production. They said that the British crew didn't completely understand David Lynch, his ideas. Like apparently the way he would talk about his ideas. Anyone who's ever heard David Lynch, it can be a little esoteric. So they said the crew didn't really initially at first understand what he was going for, but once they started to see the results, they were like, we don't have to understand him. We're just going to do what he asks us to do. And they went along with it. They loved him. They loved the film. There weren't really any major hitches in production. The only real point of contention was Anthony Hopkins did not particularly like David Lynch as a director. He thought he was an okay person, but again, his directions were a bit esoteric. And David Lynch tells the story, or told the story several times, that there was one time he asked Anthony Hopkins to, look a certain way, and Hopkins said, basically, my character wouldn't do that. And that made David Lynch very angry because he said, he couldn't get Hopkins to cooperate. And he said, why won't he do what I tell him to do? I'm the director. And it was pretty well known that Hopkins didn't really respect Lynch very much, and at one point called Mel Brooks and wanted to get David Lynch replaced, because he goes, I don't know who this kid is. Why is he getting to direct this movie? Who's ever heard of him? He's kind of weird. I don't understand what he wants. And Hopkins wanted him replaced. And Mel Brooks basically said something along the lines of, he's a genius. I'm sticking with it. You can quit if you want, but I'm behind David Lynch. And so Hopkins went along and he finished the job. And apparently, when it was all over and he saw the film, he wrote David Lynch a letter and apologized for his behavior. He said, I didn't understand, and I see what you were going for, and I apologize for, my behavior. So they did eventually make up, but they didn't get along very well during the making of the movie. So that was about the only real hitch that there was.
well, yeah, and the thing is that it gave Anthony Hopkins, like you said, a real boost. I mean, his career I
Yes.
remember the two things I remember him prior to this was I remember he was Bruno Hauptmann in the Lindbergh kidnapping case, which
Yes,
was made for NBC television.
that's correct. Yes, yes, right.
And I remember him in the remake of Dark Victory opposite Elizabeth Montgomery. He's the doctor that has to tell her she's going to die of a brain
Yes.
tumor, and they
Very
fall in
good.
love.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And those are both good performances. I think they're good TV movies. I actually had a 16 millimeter print of Dark Victory at one point because it was
Ah,
so. This is pre YouTube, and you couldn't see
yeah.
it any other place. And I found a guy who had a print of it for $25. So I was like,
Oh, cool.
it's worth $25 for a copy of Dark Victory. And
Sure.
it was subsequently edited, I think, and rebroadcast. I know that I'm really getting into the weeds here, but
Mm.
subsequently edited for rebroadcasts. And this was the complete 2.5 hour version that was,
Ah, okay, okay.
so yeah, I had it. And then once it became available on YouTube, I sold it and made a little profit off of it. So,
Very good, very good. Yeah, yeah.
but, yeah,
Well, here's a bit of trivia that you will know. I don't know if general folks will remember this movie, but one of the problems they had on the film was that Hopkins had a hard stop date that they could not go past. And Jonathan Sanger, he wrote a little book about the making of the Elephant Man, and he said that he called up the producer of the film because it's not unheard of for two producers to call and say, "Hey, we might run a couple of days over. Could you reschedule a little bit?" And Anthony might be a couple days late if we have to run over the schedule. And most of the time, people are accommodating with that kind of thing if they can be. And apparently, he said the producer of the film that Hopkins was supposed to go to basically said, "F you. Uh, Hopkins will be on the set on the day he's supposed to be, or I'm going to sue all of you for this, that, and the other thing." And he said the guy was incredibly rude, and Sanger said, "Okay, we'll do what we can." And they ended up getting Hopkins finished on time, and they got him to the set of A Change of Seasons. If you remember that movie.
I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and the reason most of you listening who don't know it, there's a reason why you don't know it. Let's put it
Yes.
that way. So,
Yeah, that's pretty jaw-dropping. Although apparently Hopkins had told Sanger, "I'll stay as long as I need to." But the producer was like, "I'll sue all of you." So Hopkins got to go there so he could romp in the hot tub with a very nude Bo Derek. So there you go.
I actually have a copy of that on DVD.
Do
Believe it
you?
or not, I'll cop to it.
They ran it a couple of years ago. I don't own a copy of it, but they ran it, and I remember seeing it at the time because I was a teenage boy. So of course I saw everything with Bo Derek in it.
Oh
But
yeah,
I didn't really have much of a memory of it. It's a terrible movie.
yeah, it's not good. It's not good.
It's really bad. But anyway, that was
I think I picked up a copy of it that was missing the case, and it was just the disc only, and I got it for like $1, and I thought, it's worth $1. I'll just
yeah, for
something
sure,
like
for
that.
sure.
So it's in the library somewhere,
There you go.
but it's
There
in
you
there.
go.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, and one more piece of trivia that I talking about prior to the Elephant Man. I don't know how true this is, but they say that David Lynch was working as a roofer, to make a
Yeah.
living before putting up roofs or
Yeah. Well, when
roofs.
he was making the Elephant Man, he would work on the Elephant Man all night, and then he had a paper route. He'd drive around LA delivering papers like first thing in the morning, and that would be how he did that. His father bought a house out here somewhere because David Lynch was from Virginia, originally from Montana, but grew up mostly in Virginia. And his father bought a house that he let David remodel and said you could like live in it after you remodel it. And yeah, he did roofing and he liked to build sheds, apparently. That was his thing. So he and
Hmm.
Harrison Ford, I guess, were running around doing carpentry all over LA, before their careers hit. But yeah, the Elephant Man was his first real job, like, like where he had to go to work every day and get paid. Um, and we should also mention that he brought in some amazing some talent to help. The director of photography was Freddie Francis, who's a famous British cinematographer. Because one of the things they decided early on was to shoot the film in black and white, which at that time was not common. Most movies at that point were in color, and they wanted someone who had experience with black and white photography. And Freddie Francis had shot a very famous film called Sons and Lovers, which is a black and white black and white movie, I think based on a novel by D.H. Lawrence, that was filmed in the UK, and he'd done a number of other films. And he was just one of those exquisite British cinematographers who had just wonderful experience both in black and white and color. And he had actually stopped, he hadn't shot a film in 15 years when they did The Elephant Man because he had segued into becoming a director. He had directed a number of Hammer horror films. And most famously, he directed one of the great bad movies of all time, Joan Crawford's last picture, Trog, which if you haven't seen
Yes.
Trog, by all means, rush out and see it. Somebody got an extra mask from 2001 and made a monster movie out of it. But so he had not shot film, and they approached him, and he agreed to be the cinematographer for The Elephant Man, and got along so well with David Lynch that he did two more movies with him. And Freddie Francis returned to being a cinematographer, ultimately winning an Oscar for, I believe it was Glory.
Yes, that is
Um,
correct.
yeah, and he shot Dune for David Lynch
Hmm.
and a bunch of other things. So he began his career as a cinematographer, was a director for a while, and then finished his career as an Academy Award-winning cinematographer. And he is one of the all-time greats. And The Elephant Man is an exquisite-looking picture. Um, one of David Lynch's big things was textures. He just loved the textures of Victorian England, and that Freddie Francis really helped bring all of that out. And they said that was one of the advantages to filming in black and white is you could really get the feel for basically the industrial age England. And they worked very hard to accomplish that. They had a production designer named Stuart Craig, and Stuart Craig eventually went on. He did Gandhi and a number of other films. He became quite a well-known production designer, but this was his first film as a production designer, and his work is exquisite. They found some actual locations. They actually found an abandoned British hospital or an abandoned ward in a British hospital that basically someone had locked the door on in like 1892 and just walked away from. So when they opened it up, there were broken windows and bird droppings everywhere, but all of the furniture, all of the installations were exactly the same. So they cleaned it up, and it appears in the film. They found all sorts of they found the docklands in London, which still look the same way that they did back in the time of the film, and they dressed those and filmed. Now, right after they did the film, all of that was destroyed, and now there are these big fancy apartments on the wharf in England. But at that time, it still looked the way it did. So they used real life locations, and then they also built a number of sets in Lee Studios, which is in Wembley outside of London, which was just a small rental facility that mostly they did television things in. But the people who owned it basically allowed Brooks Films to take over the whole place for the duration of the shoot. So that worked better for them than using one of the better known studios like Pinewood or Elstree, which they would have had to have shared it. So they basically had their own studio, and yeah, and they had like the cream of the crop of the grips and the lighting technicians and all of that. They didn't have a ton of special effects in the picture, but they had great crew there. So they had a wonderful crew, all of whom were willing to go along with David Lynch. David Lynch, whenever he talked about the Elephant Man, just raved about the crew. And apparently it was a good shoot for everybody, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, sure sounds like it based on what I'm seeing and based on what you're saying. It definitely sounds like it. It's funny you mentioned Freddie Francis. He also, I think The Straight Story was another David
Yes.
Lynch collaboration that it's really pretty exquisite in terms of his. I think that was their last collaboration together, I believe. But
It was their last collaboration, and it was Freddie's last film.
oh yeah, yeah, that sounds about right. But that's another great,
Yes.
exquisitely shot film. So yeah, I understand there was a little bit of controversy with some of the surrealism that David Lynch put in the film. Not maybe not too much controversy, but it did cause some discussion, I guess is the best way to.
Yeah. Well, Lynch, anyone who saw Eraserhead, uh, there are several sequences. They're either dream or hallucination sequences that have the same feel, kind of a surrealistic feel to them in The Elephant Man. David Lynch, when he came on the project, he rewrote the script with Chris DeVore and Eric Bergman, and they said that mostly his contributions were to add these sort of fantasies and dream sequences. Ann B. Coates, who was the editor, another person we should mention, famous editor, most famously cut Lawrence of Arabia, worked on a lot of David Lean's films and many, many, many other films, one of the great film editors of all time. And apparently she had some questions. She talked to Mel and to Jonathan Sanger, like, I'm not sure about these, some of these surreal things. And Jonathan Sanger said, give David a chance and work with him and see what you can do. And apparently by the time it was over, it was just a love fest between the two of them. But, people wondered what were the surrealistic sequences going to work. It's also the source of one of my all-time favorite Mel Brooks quotes, because I guess when they screened the film for Paramount, there was some question. Some of the executives didn't like the surreal bits and suggested they be cut out. And they kind of talked about it like they had a say over the movie. The thing, again, to remind people of is The Elephant Man was an independent film. Paramount was distributing it. They didn't make it, which meant they weren't allowed a certain, they couldn't tell them what to do, basically. And apparently Mel Brooks's response to the suggestion that the surreal sequences was, he said, we are engaged in a business venture together. We are showing you the film as a courtesy to further that venture. We did not show it to you to solicit the opinions of raging primitives. and that was his response to Paramount, who no longer had anything to say about the surrealistic elements of the film.
I love it. So, that's great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, it was released in the fall of 1980, October. I think New York got it first, I believe, and then it made its way around the United States a couple of weeks later.
Yeah.
And actually, we didn't get it in my hometown until April of the following year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
About 6 months later. But back then, things took a little longer sometimes. And but it was worth the wait. I remember seeing the previews. Now, it was playing in some of the larger cities in my area, but we didn't. Getting my parents to drive to a bigger city just for the specific purpose of seeing a movie. Now, we would go record shopping or that sort of thing, but not driving 45 minutes just to go see a movie. So that wasn't going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
So it was showing in some of the larger cities around where I live, but that wasn't going to happen. So I saw it in the little small town theater, same place I saw Towering Inferno and King Kong. Ironically, that theater closed that very same year in the fall, in September. Yeah. Its final film was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre re-release in September of that year. So, yeah. But anyway, the Century Theater, long may I remember it. But anyway, but it did well on its budget of $5 million. I think grossed 20 some million. I think close
something
to 20,
like that, right?
25.
Mm-hmm.
Did really well in Japan. The research that I'm seeing here, that it came in second to The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
So that was a kind of theatrical rentals of a 2.45 billion, I guess, yen, I would say.
Mm.
So that's yeah, that's really interesting. The critical response pretty positive for the most part. We
Yep.
There were a few naysayers like Roger Ebert, which is surprising because he was usually a very he had a critic with a he was a critic known for his sentimentality, and
Yes. Yeah.
he wrote. I kept asking myself what the film was really trying to say about the human condition,
Mm.
as reflected by John Merrick, and I kept drawing blanks. I was so shocked that he disliked this film. I thought it would be catnip to him based on some of the other things that he had
Sure.
liked over the years, but he would throw us a surprise every now and then.
When Roger missed, he missed a lot. So,
Yeah, I know. He
yeah.
also missed American Werewolf in London the
Yeah.
following year. I remember that. So there was
Very,
two
very
there
much
that
so.
I didn't quite, but generally speaking, he was a great critic. But occasionally he would shock me, and not in a good way.
Right.
So yeah, and then of course it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and it tied Raging Bull at the
Yeah.
53rd Academy Awards in terms of the number of nominations. But the caveat is it did not win any,
That's right.
unfortunately.
Right. Right.
uh,
None at all, unfortunately.
but it did do one thing. Because of the outcry that there was no recognition for its extraordinary makeup. They decided to give makeup artists their own category the following
Yep.
year, and the Academy Award for Best Makeup was introduced with, and we'll do a call back here, An American Werewolf in London as
That's
its
right.
first recipient the following
Mr.
year.
Mr. Baker. Yes.
So there we go, and of course that calls back to King Kong, which is
All
we
things call
spoke
back
of
to King
earlier.
Kong.
It does. So it's funny how this all circles around. Yeah, this is yeah, it's amazing to think that they didn't have makeup awards, considering some of the films that had come out prior to this. Pretty amazing when you think
Pretty
about
much
it.
anything Dick Smith did, like
Oh
these.
yeah,
Yeah.
and Planet of the Apes. You think about John
Yes.
Chambers and all that.
Yeah.
That to think those films were overlooked. It's just because they didn't have a category. It's just amazing. But yeah, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, I remember that. I believe this was the Academy Awards that was delayed. I believe because of
Yes.
the shooting
Yeah.
of attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. I
Yes.
believe, if
It was
memory serves.
postponed till the following evening.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah. So this was kind of the 53rd Academy Awards is a little. It was scheduled for March 30th, and I think it was March 31st when it actually finally
Yeah.
aired. So yeah, and so that's another little a bit of minor trivia there. But anyway, so what was your first experience? Like I said, my mother took me to see it just, and I was in the fifth grade, and I was just completely blown away, fixated on this. Bought the paperback novelization of it
Yes.
quickly thereafter. I was just could not stop talking about The Elephant Man. It was just an amazing movie. The makeup effects were just incredible, and it was so well acted, so moving. I was almost 10 at the time, but it really struck me on a very deep level. So I'm curious to hear what your first experience was like.
Well, I loved it. I was a little familiar, because the other thing we should mention is there was a Broadway play also titled The Elephant Man, which had started running in, I believe it was 77, end of 77, early 78. I'm trying to remember the exact date. And I had not seen it, but I lived in the New York area. And when you live in the New York area, there are constantly ads for Broadway plays. So I was very aware of the play. And I wanted to see it because I had read a little bit about what the story was. And I found the story fascinating. But I did eventually see the play. I didn't see it until after I saw the film. And the play it's actually a wonderful play. It takes a very different approach to the story. It instead of, well, actually not the story, but the production, instead of having the actor on stage in makeup, which they couldn't really do practically, for a stage performance, they actually cast the most beautiful looking actors they could find, the most handsome men. And what they would do is at the opening of the play, the doctor would show you a picture of the actual Elephant Man. And the actor, as they were reading the descriptions of all of his deformities, would twist their bodies into an approximation of John Merrick's, twisted form. They wouldn't put makeup on him. They would have him be a very handsome actor. The idea being that you were supposed to be seeing the beautiful soul beneath the surface. It's a very theatrical gimmick, and it's not something that you could replicate in a movie. But anyway, I was very aware of the play and of the story, and so I was very interested to see the film. And probably like you, when I saw the one sheet, which is the Elephant Man in his cloak and in his the hood, it's such a striking poster. It's such a striking image, that I couldn't wait to see the film. We didn't get it right away. It opened again end of September, beginning of October, but it finally came to us around November. And I remember my sister and I went to see it. We had dinner one night with the family, and then just sort of spontaneously decided to go and see it. I think it had just opened, and I just loved it. I find the story of Merrick very moving anyway, and I just thought the film was brilliant. It looked exactly like what it should look like. It had the right feel, and I was really blown away by it. And I've watched it many, many times since, and I've had more of a sort of a look, watched it with a critical eye, and I realized, like, the things that they did in it, it's a true life story. In some ways, it is structured like a horror film. And I think in a way that helps it work because, horror films, especially those of monstrous creatures, follow a certain pattern, which is the creature appears, you don't quite see it, eventually you see it, and eventually you come to learn what it's all about. Well, the Elephant Man follows that exact structure, only its purposes are completely different. You originally think it may horrify you, but eventually, as the film goes on and you come to understand the Elephant Man, you find yourself with full empathy rather than with full horror. So it's kind of a brilliant twist on a certain kind of structure. And the other thing I think is very interesting, especially given if you've ever seen Eraserhead, which was such a modern experimental film, is in many ways The Elephant Man is a very traditional film. It has very traditional framing and staging and cutting patterns. And I think so it's an interesting mix of old fashioned and cutting edge. And I think that works very well for the story because there is sort of a fairy tale aspect to the story. And I think they managed to really nail it. And I think my favorite sequence in the film, which by the way is completely fictional, never happened in Joseph Merrick's real life, but he is kidnapped by his former promoter and taken to Europe and put on display in a tawdry sideshow, and then is beaten almost to death by the promoter. And then he is rescued by the rest of the freaks in the freak show, the main character, which is played by Kenny Baker, who was R2-D2 in the Star Wars movies. And they carry him through what looks like a swamp and get him to the ferry that takes him back to England. It has such a haunting, not surreal, but fairy tale quality, myth quality to it that I think is Lynch at his best in this film. Um, that how could you not be moved by seeing it? I just thought it was a lovely telling of the story.
Oh yeah, it truly was, and I remember seeing it on cable in the fall of 1982. It made its cable debut, and I remember my father was not one who easily shed tears during films. Not at least
Yeah.
when other people were around. I think maybe privately he did, but that was one that made him shed tears. I remember
Yeah.
when he saw it, and so yeah, that was just It was, yeah, and that poster, it's funny you mentioned that. I've tried so hard to figure out who was the illustrator on that, and I can't seem to find out for sure who was the artist, because that is a striking poster. I was like you, I was just really fascinated by it, seeing it when it turned up in newspaper ads and seeing it in the theater, and just yeah. So I would love to know who actually.
I don't know the names, but I know it was an on-set photograph, and his name is escaping me. Whoever the unit photographer was, and then Paramount took it and did whatever they did to it. It's got some kind of not quite solarization, but they did some kind of treatment to the image. I don't know who at Paramount did it or whether they had, contracted it out to an agency or something. But I know Paramount's responsible for that poster. So it really is a striking one. I went out also. I love the score by John Morris.
Oh, I was going to mention that. Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I bought the album. It's one it wasn't my first soundtrack album, but it was one of my I still have it. It's actually sitting right here as we speak. And a lovely, wonderful score, and then supplemented in the end by a classical composition, Adagio for Strings by Samuel Barber, which
Hmm.
apparently John Morris wasn't thrilled they were using someone else's music. But it, as David Lynch and Jonathan Sanger told it, they were driving to the set one day, they heard that on the radio. David Lynch was really attracted to it. They got the recording from the radio station, played it with the movie, and he said it never changed from that day. Like I think John Morris thought it was a temp track, but Lynch said it was never ever going to change from that day on.
Yeah, and then Oliver Stone took it and did something else with
Yeah,
Platoon.
yes, he
So
did.
it's
Yes, he did.
completely.
And I
Uh,
remember watching Platoon. I said, "Oh, the Elephant Man."
That's exactly
So,
what I remember saying too when I saw
yeah,
Platoon in theaters. Yeah, I remember, yeah, because people were like, "Oh, that's so many people, my contemporaries at the time, they were like, oh, that's such a beautiful piece of music." I said, "Yeah, I thought the same thing when I heard it, The Elephant Man, 6 years ago."
exactly, exactly.
So yeah, so it is a great soundtrack. It's interesting, some of the sequencing of the music is done differently on the album. So that
Yes,
took a
yeah,
little getting used to when I first, because I was so accustomed to hearing it as it's presented in the film, and then the sequencing
sure.
is slightly different. But John Morris, a great composer, and obviously he did a lot of work for Mel Brooks. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's how he got the job, probably because it was a
I
Brooks
believe
film
that's
presentation.
exactly how he got the job. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think Mel said, consider John. And they said, sure, we'll consider John. So,
He's a great choice, though. He was a very,
yeah.
very good composer, and one of my favorite film songs, like songs from any film. And I've always said I would like to have it played at my funeral. I've said it half jokingly, but there's some seriousness there. Is from the 12 Chairs, "Hope for the
Yeah.
best, expect the
Yes.
worst."
Yes. 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 Yes.
Yeah, but anyway. Well, on that note, I guess we've pretty much said everything we want to say about the Elephant Man, I think, unless there's something else you want to add. I think we've been pretty comprehensive here with our
Yeah.
telling of the story, or you have rather. You did a great
What
job
I,
as always.
oh, thank you. I know. I think we got it. I just think if anyone's listening who has seen the film, please go watch it again. Anyone who's not seen it, please go watch it because it's funny. I've seen it many times. I've not watched it recently, so I rewatched it knowing you and I were going to talk about it, and I just loved it all over again. Like you said at the top, for me, it's my favorite David Lynch film. I know it's probably not his most typical film. But in a way, it's his most traditional movie, but it's the one I go back to because I admire Blue Velvet. I understand why people like it, but I can't say that's a film I embrace. I think sometimes when you go too surreal, it can distance you from the audience, and I did find that in that picture. I understand its merits. It's not a film I will like willingly go back to time and time again. The Elephant Man, I will, because it's a moving story, but it's so well told. And when you think about that, this was really only his second film and his first, you know, professional feature, it's even more amazing.
It really is. It really, truly is. And yeah, interesting tidbit also is that there were some rumors that he was actually after this film, there was talk of him directing Halloween 2, but it didn't come to pass. So
Well, he got a lot of offers off of The Elephant Man. He was famously offered Return of the Jedi,
that's right. Yeah, I
which he
forgot about that.
accepted and then turned down because I guess he had a panic attack. And yeah, I had actually heard Halloween 2 as well, which is kind of amusing to think of what he would have done with that. But of course, he chose Dune, which, he eventually distanced himself from, but I will say I prefer his version to the more recent ones. It had an insanity to it that seemed appropriate.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And he did have a quirky sense of humor that which is sorely missing from all of the recent iterations of Doom. Denis Villeneuve,
Yeah.
you can say a lot of things about him, but funny isn't one of them.
I would agree.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that his when he takes on the Bond franchise, as has been talked about, I wouldn't be expecting any humor there either. But anyway,
I'm not.
none of the Roger Moore puns.
No, you and I will have a long talk about that particular prospect.
Oh yes, yes, yes,
But we will
yes.
do it not on the podcast because people don't want to hear me complaining.
Yeah, that's a whole other
So,
story. Yes, but
right.
anyway, yeah, this is this is and I feel the same way about David Lynch. It's just like people love Mulholland Drive. I've tried to embrace it, and again, like you said, I just the surrealism just it's just not my cup of tea. And
Yeah.
that's not to say it's not well done. It's not to say it's no knocks against his filmmaking. It's just it's not really my thing. And the straight story was pretty much a straightforward. It's
Yeah.
interesting that that's the title of the film, and it's kind of similar to The Elephant Man in a lot of ways. And I really embrace the straight story as well, which I find interesting. So,
I guess
um,
in a way, I wish he'd made a few more with quotes around it, normal movies, because I think he was good at it, and I
yeah.
would like to have seen some more of them. But and there's a place for the other ones as well.
Hmm.
But I think the Elephant Man's the one I'm going to return to again and again.
Same here. Well, on that note, I guess we'll end this edition of Adam's Corner. With another subject to tackle in a couple of months.
I look forward to it.